Now we're prepared to plunge into a deeper layer of chess, strategical thinking. Part of the reason I call chess the black and white jungle is because chess positions can sometimes seem alien and foreboding, with danger lurking in every crevice. Other times the game can feel lush and natural, the moves coming to us like raindrops, steadily falling into our minds as if from nowhere. The key to feeling at ease within the complexities of diverse chess positions is to have an understanding of the operating principles that govern all scenarios. Then the moves can spring out of our intuitions like magic, and chess can become a thrilling, artistic experience. In Part 3 of the Academy, we'll discuss critical chess principles that can serve as beacons for long-term strategical thinking in positions that might otherwise seem devoid of logic. After this part of the Academy, you'll have a sense of direction in virtually any chess situation because you'll have an eye for its essential components. Like the tactics we discussed in Part 2, the strategical ideas we're about to take on are the building blocks to the most advanced chess ideas. Soak them in, and you'll be on your way. Before discussing opening principles, I need to clarify the importance of the opening in the study of chess. The most common error that chess teachers and players make is to spend the beginning of their chess lives memorizing opening variations with which they think they can win lots of quick games. There is nothing more tempting than learning to win fast, but this is a terrible mistake. If you memorize variations, you may do well in the short run, but over time you'll falter because you're not learning the heart of chess. When I began my study of chess when I was 6 years old, my first teacher and I spent years studying the endgame. This may sound counterintuitive to some people, because I was working on positions I may never see again, but I promise you, this is the right way to go. By studying each chess piece in isolation, I learned the power of empty space. The chessboard possesses fascinating subtleties which emerge over time, and I learned the essence of the chess pieces because I studied them in positions of reduced complexity. What was important was that I was learning the principles which govern all chess positions. You may have noticed that this is the spirit of this academy. I'm teaching you ideas that are universal to your chess experience. Growing up, I was the highest-rated kid in the country from the age of 8 on, and all the other top players were always gunning for me. There was one coach in particular who ran the program at the school that was the main rival to Dalton, the school I attended from 3rd to 10th grade. This guy taught his students the openings beyond all else. His students had countless traps memorized, and many of them were prepared specifically for my opening repertoire. Playing against these kids was always dangerous because the beginning of the game was like walking through a minefield. I often came out of the opening down a pawn or two, but I never lost one national championship game to one of these kids. I might have been in a little trouble off the bat, but as the games progressed, I got stronger, and they got weaker, because I was moving towards my area of comfort, the endgame, and they were leaving their memorized openings. During my years, the Dalton team won 7 national championships, and I won 8 individual national titles, while our rival was usually just behind, in 2nd or 3rd place. I would argue that it wasn't the kids who held themselves back. They were all astonishingly gifted children, but it was the short-sighted approach of their coach. Perhaps the most important thing about beginning with the endgame and chess principles instead of memorization is that this way you enjoy the beauty of chess without being completely focused on winning. A key component on the road to mastery is to embrace the journey as opposed to fixating on results. That way you can deal with the inevitable ups and downs of competition without falling apart. The endgame is where you should focus the beginnings of your chess education, and I would recommend that soon after completing this course you turn your attention to my endgame lessons, in which I teach the essentials of this rich part of the game. Now, with that understanding, I would be remiss to ignore the openings altogether in this academy, because then you sit down to play your first chess games and have no idea what to do. I expect I then get some angry letters on my website. So what we're going to do is learn some principles of opening play. I'll teach you ideas that can be applied to virtually any situation you run up against, and this way you can feel confident no matter what your opponent throws at you. I want to emphasize that in this academy we are taking our first steps to thinking about chess like a master. We are not learning how to trick a beginner. Now to the principles of opening play. I always begin by moving my king pawn out, e4. Let's say your opponent doesn't get to move. This is how you should develop your pieces. Your next move should be d4. Now this is only, of course, if black hasn't made another central pawn move to challenge that square. So now your e-pawn and your d-pawn control this whole area of the board. This is very important. And also notice how your bishops are wide open. They can slice into the game. Your queen is open. Your knights can come out. Having your pawns on e4 and d4 gives you an excellent central control. Next, I would develop my knight to f3. There's a saying in opening play, knights before bishops. So in many opening positions, you'll have a choice. You can bring out either your knight or your bishop. In those situations, usually you'll bring out your knight first. So knight f3. Next, you might play bishop c4. This opens up your king to be able to castle to the king's side. Notice all the pieces are moving towards the center of the board. I'm not playing moves like knight h3. I'm playing moves like knight f3, controlling the middle. Now I might castle. My king is nice and safe. The f2, g2, and h2 pawns are in front of my king, guarding him. Very, very safe. Now, another important idea is that we don't want to advance our pawns ahead of our king, at least not too far. I often describe this as creating air, as if the king can feel a draft. In other words, if I were to push these pawns, say to h4 and g4, my king would get much, much less safe, because pieces could slip in the cracks. So here my king is very safe. I have my knight out, my bishop out. Now I might bring my other knight into the game, knight c3. And now my other bishop could come out, either to e3 or f4. Next, I would bring my queen, and this connects the rooks. This is a saying in development in chess, connect your rooks. If I have all my minor pieces out and my queen, and I castle, my rooks are connected. They're both ready to jump into the middle of the board, for example d1 and e1. In general, you want rooks on open lines, so probably either the e file or the d file or another one will have opened up. You want to put your rook on the open file, so if the b pawn weren't there, this rook would belong on b1. If the c pawn weren't there, the rook would belong on c1. You want your rooks on open files. This is the classical developmental scheme. But of course, your opponent gets to move too. Now notice how when I developed all my pieces, I never moved one piece twice. This is another principle of opening play. Move each piece once. You don't want to move a piece too many times. For example, I brought my knight to f3, my bishop to c4, my other knight to c3, my bishop to f4. I castled. My queen came to d2. Each piece has moved only once, and consequently I've developed all of my pieces. If I had moved my light-squared bishop to c4 or to b5 to a4 to b3, and then back to c4 again, then none of my other pieces would have been developed. A lot of people make this mistake. They focus on one piece and move it over and over and over. Don't do that in chess. So let's review the principles we've talked about so far. First, we control the center, moves like e4 and d4. Knights before bishops. You develop your kingside knight out to f3. Usually you'll develop the pieces on the side you want to castle first. Obviously, then your king can jump into safety whenever it needs to. Next move, bishop c4. Into the center. You can castle away. King safety. Then you can bring your other pieces into the game, trying not to move one piece too many times. Then you can bring your queen in, into the middle. Now this brings up a really important idea. Don't bring out your queen too early. Some of you probably remember that from the movie, Searching for Bobby Fischer. I used to make that mistake. When I was a little boy, I used to bring out my queen too early. It's very tempting because she's your most powerful piece, so you want to bring her to the game fast. Let me show you why it's a mistake. Let's say you're playing white. You play e4. Your opponent plays d5. And you take the pawn. Now, of course, you don't want to play a move like knight f3 there, because then they could take your e4 pawn. There's no room for mechanical thinking in chess. They play d5, and you take it. E takes d5, black responds, queen takes d5. Now, the black queen has come into the game too fast. Now you want to develop your pieces while attacking the queen. Chase the queen all over the board. Say you play knight c3. The knight comes into the game, and the queen has to move. Let's say queen g5. Now you can bring another piece into the game and chase the queen. Knight f3. So now, white has two minor pieces into the game, and black's queen is running all over the place. Let's say he plays queen h6. Now stick to the principles. You can take control of the center, and prepare more development. d4, opening up a discovered attack from the bishop on c1 onto the queen on h6. Let's say black plays queen f6. Now you want to keep the same thing going. You want to bring another minor piece into the game with tempo. Bishop g5. You see how all of white's pieces are coming into the game, and the black queen is just being chased all over the place? After bishop g5, let's say black plays queen f5. Now, what would you do here? Bishop d3. Another strong developmental move, attacking the queen. Black will run away again. queen g4. Now black's attacking our g2 pawn. He has a threat, but that's not a problem. We can simply castle. Take a look at this position. You wouldn't believe how often something like this occurs. Black's queen has been running all over the place. White's developed both knights, both bishops, a strong pawn in the center, and white castled the king to safety. White has a huge advantage here because he developed with principle, while black brought out the queen too early and moved the same piece too many times. So you can see how black's problems were all based on not following the principles, and all of white's moves, which were very, very good, were based on following the principles. This is how you should think about chess, and this is a great way to approach the opening. Now you've heard me talk about king safety. One last point. Whenever you have a principle that you want to use, you also want to think about how to prevent your opponent from using those ideas. So you want to develop while preventing your opponent from developing. You want to bring your king to safety while preventing your opponent from castling his king to safety. You want to control the center while preventing your opponent from controlling the center. You want to move each piece of yours once while trying to incite your opponent to move as many pieces of his as many times as possible. This is how it works in chess. So every principle you learn will have more than one side to it. Whose position do you prefer here? Very good. It turns out that white is better, because the weak king is quite important. There is no forced win, but white has a lot of factors working to his advantage. Whenever you look at a chess position, the first thing you should do is notice the material differences. Begin with the pawns, count them. Here you see black has 7 pawns and white has 6, so black's up a pawn. Then move to queens, both sides have queens. Rooks, both sides have 2 rooks. Bishops, both sides have 1 bishop. And knights, here both sides have 2 knights. So black's up a pawn. On the other hand, white has much more development, a safer king, and central control. So this position is one of trade-offs, material for time and quality. Time, in this case, meaning development, and quality meaning white's pieces are better placed. How about this position? It's white's move. Who would you play here, black or white? That's right. White is better here. Think about the themes previously discussed. What is white's best move? The relevant theme here is king safety. That's not the best move. Good work. The best move is bishop takes f7. And after the trade, bishop takes f7, king takes f7. White can play, for example, knight e5 check, and white has an attack against the black king. And most important, black can never castle to safety because the king is already moved. This means that the king will be stuck in an open center for a long time, and it will be hard for black to continue development because the rooks will be penned in by a king stuck on f8 or e8. This is one of the main drawbacks to not having the king castled away. The rooks aren't connected, and so they can't play actively in the game. Winning chess games as you face off against tougher opponents isn't just about mating and winning material. Sometimes our goal is to gain a strategic advantage, like having a long-term developmental edge and a safer king. It's white to move here. Who do you think is better? Click on white or black. That's right. It would be easy to think of this position as one of trade-offs. White has more pawn development, and black has more piece development. It's important to know how to evaluate such situations. The most important issue here is quality of development. White has complete central domination, and black's knights are stuck on the side of the board, so the development is not so useful. If you focused on central control in your evaluation, then you had your eye on the ball. White is much better. One way to see this is to imagine how easily white can develop all his pieces, while black's game is cramped and difficult to handle. Remember, when developing, we want to begin by establishing at least one pawn in the center, holding our ground. Okay, let's say you begin a chess game e4, e5, and your opponent plays queen h5, bringing out the queen too early. It's a bad move that lots of beginners play. How can you develop a minor piece into the center and defend the e5 pawn? Good job. Knight c6. Developing a minor piece into the middle of the board and defending the e5 pawn. This way you're responding to your opponent's threat and developing. Now let's say white plays bishop c4. What do you like for black now? No, that's not quite right. Try again. No, that's not quite right. Try again. Good job. A lot of beginners try this opening out. Queen h5, bishop c4, and you see white's threat here? White wants to play queen takes f7, checkmate. This is called a fool's mate. So with black now, you have to defend the mate. The best way is to defend the mate in a manner that will allow you to continue with your development. Here there are a lot of moves. You can play g6, blocking the queen's attack on f7, attacking the queen, and also preparing what's called a fianchetto of the black bishop. This is a fianchetto. The bishop goes to g7. Black can continue then, knight f6 for example, and then castling kingside. This is a very stable, well-protected king position. If you play g6, let's say your opponent plays queen f3. Remember, no mechanical thinking. I just showed you want to play bishop g7 to fianchetto your bishop, but here your opponent is threatening f7 again, so you defend it, knight f6. The knight is defended by your queen on d8, your next move will be bishop g7. Now white's queen is moved twice in the opening, and it's exposed on f3. Black has a very good position, because white tried to trap it. Your next move will be bishop g7, castle to safety, and black has a great game. More development. In this position, you could also defend on f7 by playing queen e7. True, you've developed your queen early in the game, but your queen is much less exposed than your opponent's. Let's say that white were to play a3, a meaningless move in the side of the board, but beginners will play this way. Develop with tempo. What should black play now? Excellent work. Knight f6 is the best move, centralizing the knight and attacking the white queen. Let's say white plays queen h3. Now black can win a piece. Do you see how? d5. A discovered attack. The bishop on c8 goes after the queen on h3, and the d5 pawn is attacking the bishop on c4. Good work. So white brought out his queen too early, and black took advantage. Whenever your opponent plays strangely, like white did in this example, you should keep a sharp lookout for his threats while playing according to the principles. Remember, stop your opponent's ideas and continue with yours. Take a look at this position. Do you think bishop c5 or knight e7 is better for black? Excellent work. It turns out that bishop c5 is best, because it develops and allows for future development. Let's take a look at what would happen with the other move. After knight e7, black has blocked in the bishop on f8, and so the knight will have to move again to keep on bringing out pieces, and this violates the principle of moving a piece only once in the opening. Okay, so the principles we just discussed are all you need to know about the openings. Now let's move on to the real chess. Many of our strategic decisions in chess come from the nuances of pawn structure. While the least valuable piece individually, the pawn is arguably the most important element of evaluating chess positions, because structure is what gives dynamic potential to all the other pieces. I'll begin by teaching some of the pros and cons of various pawn formations, and then we'll see how they can be applied to strategic thinking. In this position, black's f-pawns are doubled. The f6 and f7 pawns are on the same rank. That's called doubled pawns. If this were a middle game position, and black were castled kingside, then the doubled pawns would be a hazard to king safety, because of the open g-file and weak h6 square. In an endgame, white might be able to slip in and attack the unsupportable h-pawn. If the f6 pawn, on the other hand, were on g7, there'd be no way for white to penetrate. One way of forcing this type of structural weakness in your opponent's position can be seen here. Take a look. It's white to move here. Do you see a way to force the weakening of black's pawn structure? Excellent work. Here, the bishop on g5 pins the knight on f6. You can attack the pinned piece with knight d5. There's no way for black to prevent knight takes f6, g takes f6, after which the king will be a little less safe and the f-pawn's doubled. Let's say after knight d5, black plays the interesting move knight a5. White's bishop on c4 is pretty active, and so black chooses to trade knight for bishop. A good idea. Notice that the bishop can't escape, because after bishop b5, then black can play c6 and cause problems. The bishop for knight trade is going to happen. White just has to decide how. A key principle with pawns is to take towards the center. We always want to improve the cohesiveness of our pawns and to increase central control. After knight a5, white has a tough decision. What would you play? That's not the best move. Good job. The best move is bishop b3. After black plays knight takes b3, what should you play? The best move is a takes b3, taking towards the center. Good job. Notice also now white's rook is opened up along the a file, and white's central control is strong. This particular example of doubled pawns, the b2 and b3 pawns for white, it's not much of a weakness. Now, on the other hand, if white had played c takes b3, things would be different. Suddenly the d4 square is wide open. It's a big weakness. It's an outpost for black pieces. It can't be defended by a white pawn. Going back, if white had, say, castled here, and allowed knight takes c4, d takes c4, he also would have been forced to take away from the center. So in this position, white had to decide how to trade bishop for knight without losing central control and without weakening the pawn structure. So bishop b3, knight takes b3, a takes b3, recaptured towards the center, and white has a good game. Also notice that in this position, after white makes the inevitable trade on f6, knight takes f6, g takes f6, bishop h6, while both white and black have doubled pawns, white's position is much better, because black's doubled pawns weaken his king, and white's doubled pawns weaken nothing. Let's return to a position we saw not so long ago. We saw that black had doubled pawns. Black also has what's called isolated pawns. Isolated pawns are pawns that are exposed on open files and cannot be supported by other pawns. Here we see that black's c and h pawns are isolated. You can imagine that if white were to have two rooks on the c file or h file, this could cause big problems for black. On the other hand, if that a7 pawn were on b7 and white were to have a rook on c1, then simply c7 to c6 would put up a wall. Isolated pawns also have the downside of leaving open holes within their own camp, in which enemy pieces can comfortably lodge. We'll see more on this idea on the weak squares creating outpost section to come. Take a look at the next position. This is a typical position where black has an isolated pawn. You can see that white has the powerful d4 outpost for his knight or other pieces, and that the d5 pawn is a long-term weakness for black to deal with. Usually, when you have this type of isolated central pawn, when there are lots of pieces on the board, your best bet is to play very actively. Now let's return to that familiar pawn structure. We saw that black had double pawns and isolated pawns. There's one more weakness: pawn islands. A pawn island is a pawn or a group of pawns that has one or more files separating it from any other friendly pawns. In this position, we see that white has 2 pawn islands, and black has 4 pawn islands. This is a big difference, and it means that white's pawns will be more coordinated and have less holes in their structure as the game progresses. A trick that you can use when evaluating pawn structures, especially in or near the endgame, is to ask yourself how many pawn islands each player has. In general, the more pawn islands, the more weaknesses. Another key indicator of whether or not a pawn structure has the potential to be well coordinated is to check out whether they can create a pawn chain. Here we see the f2, e3, d4 pawns forming a chain, but there are much more powerful examples. Take a look at this. Who do you think is better here, white or black? That's right. Here the material is even, but white has a huge advantage because of his pawn structure. First of all, he has 1 pawn island to 4. Black has doubled isolated h-pawns, which are useless and very vulnerable to attack. But perhaps the most impressive element of the position is white's huge pawn chain, stretching from g2 all the way to c6. A critical thing to realize in this type of situation is that white has only one potential weakness, the g2 pawn. Black has to try to attack the base of the pawn chain, but in this position g2 is comfortably defended by the white king. In contrast, black has weaknesses all over the board. And there's another key factor. White has a protected passed pawn. A passed pawn is one that has no enemy pawns blocking its path to promotion. Passed pawns are very important, and my first teacher used to always tell me, passed pawns must be pushed. The further up the board a passer gets, the closer to promotion, and thus the more valuable it becomes. Often in endgames, and you can see this in my endgame course later on in the Academy, the position hinges on whose pawns have more potential to be promoted. In this case, both white and black have passed pawns. The main difference is that white's passed pawn is further advanced and protected, while black's passed pawn still sits on its original square and is vulnerable to attack. Passed pawns are good, and protected passed pawns are even better. Here's another factor that should help you evaluate passed pawns in endgames. Whose is further away from the action? Take a look at this position. Here, both sides have passed pawns, but who do you think is winning, white or black? No, that's not quite it. It turns out that despite the material equality, white is completely winning because he has the outside passed pawn. If black plays king d5, white plays a4. Black has no choice but to stop the promotion. King c4. The king has to leave the king side. And now white can play actively with his king. King e4. Next he can play king takes e5, followed by king f6 to g7. Takes on h7, takes on g6, and then he'll make a queen with the h-pawn, or g-pawn. White can gobble up all black's kingside pawns while the black king is preoccupied on the other side of the board. Returning to the last position. It's true, you could argue that black has the outside passed pawn, but in this case it doesn't really matter because the rook is such a powerful long-distance operator, and other factors are in this case more important. For example, the powerful pawn chain, black's many weaknesses, black's doubled pawns. White has a great game here. In chess, we're often weighing the values of different types of principles in order to properly evaluate a position. You'll get better at this as you gain experience and get used to working with the fundamentals. In time, all the principles I'm teaching you in this course will become part of your chess intuition. You'll think with them without even knowing it. For now, let's look at some of the impact of pawn structure on strategy. Okay, now let's take a look at how pawn structure determines whether the game is an open game or a closed game, and then we'll see how that affects your pieces. First of all, an open game is when the central pawn structure is airy, ripe with possibility, and not locked down. Like in this position, this is an open game. Diagonals and files are not blocked, and pieces have tremendous dynamic potential. A general rule with many exceptions is that bishops are a little stronger than knights in open games, while knights sometimes have an edge in locked-down pawn structures, in which time is not of the essence and their unique ability to leap over pieces becomes especially handy. Along those lines, what is black's best move here? No, that's not quite it. 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 Well, we know we have an open game, so knight b4 is very strong. The white bishop cannot escape the trade, and so black will have improved his position by eliminating a bishop in an open game. Without understanding how pawn structure affects the power of pieces, we would never have known where to look for the best move in this type of position. We work from our principles. Good job. Now, let's take a look at a closed game. This is a closed game because the central pawn structure is completely locked down. There is, however, a lot of play in the position. The B and H files are open, which means there is potential for both kingside and queenside attacks for either side. Remember how I said that sometimes knights are better in closed games? It's white's move here. What would you play? No, that's not quite it. That's right. Here white can play bishop b5, pinning the knight on d7 to the rook. After rook d8, bishop takes d7, rook takes d7, let's evaluate the position. The only material difference is that black has a bishop for white's knight. Which do you prefer? How do you feel about that bishop? It turns out that white's position is better because the game is closed and black's bishop is locked in by its own pawns. If it were a light-squared bishop, say on a6, then the evaluation would look quite different. Pawn structure is the crucial determinant of the strength and weakness of bishops. Here are some principles that can guide your evaluations. First of all, bishops prefer open games to closed games. Also, a bishop is good if its fixed or immobile pawns are on the opposite color, so they don't block its moves, and the opponent's fixed pawns are on the same color, providing targets. You want a bishop to have targets, not to be hemmed in by its own teammates. Take a look at this position. With what you now know about bishops, who's better here, white or black? That's right. White is better, because black has all the weaknesses and white has all the targets. A subtlety about this principle, which is a distinction that is slightly more advanced in this course, but I'll tell you anyway, is that in the middle game or opening, you should focus on central pawns that are fixed when evaluating bishops, while in the end game you should focus on all pawns. This is an idea to keep in the back of your mind for a few years down the road. Who is better here, white or black? No, that's not quite it. Black is better, because he has the good bishop. All white's pawns are on dark squares, locking in his bishop, and black has tons of targets. White has none. It's black to move here. What's your best move? That's not the best move. Bishop g4, an excellent strategical decision. Trading your bad bishop for white's good bishop, and black takes the edge. So remember, when comparing bishops and knights, bishops are usually a little better in open games, and knights are usually a little better in closed games. And when comparing bishops with other bishops, a good bishop is one that has lots of targets. If you have a light-squared bishop, you want your pawns for the most part to be on dark squares, not getting in the way, and you want your opponent's pawns to be on the same color as your bishop. Understanding what makes a bishop good is critical in knowing what and when to trade. Okay, now let's take a look at how pawn structure determines weak squares, and we'll learn how to create outposts for our pieces. It's key to notice squares in or near the enemy camp that can be supported by one or more of your pawns but cannot be defended by your opponent's pawns. If you can occupy that square with a piece that is less valuable than any of your opponent's pieces that can capture it, this can lead to a huge strategic advantage. Take a look at this position. Here it's white's move. In real chess games, there won't always be a way to win material right off the bat. Far more often, we have to improve our position strategically. What do you think white's plan should be here? After you've given this some thought, click Next. Well, the d6 square is a fabulous potential outpost for the white knight. After knight d2, an excellent move, planning a maneuver knight e4 to d6, white's position will be dominant. Notice that black can't play d5 beforehand because of en passant. After knight d6, black has little play. The c-file is the only open file on the board, and now that the knight d6 guards the c8 square, white has complete control. If you notice weak squares in your opponent's position, then you can make powerful long-term decisions. Okay, let's analyze this position after knight d2 a little bit. If black just sits around, his position will get crunched, so he has to do something. If possible, it'd be good to play b7 to b5, and then bishop c8 to b7 to c6. This locks down the c-file, defends the weak d7 pawn, and activates the bishop. That's black's plan. After b5, knight e4, bishop b7 is impossible though. Why? Because of the fork knight d6 check. So black has to castle. Now white plays knight d6, jumping into the square. Let's say black plays queen c7. Of course now black can't develop with bishop b7 because the knight guards that square. So queen c7 prepares some development. Do you see how white can win material here? Knight takes c8, removes the defender of the d7 pawn. So knight takes c8, rook takes c8, queen takes d7, wins d7, removing the defender. This wins material, but it has the downside of relieving the pressure on black's position. And this is actually one device when your opponent has a positional advantage on you and is crunching down on your game. For you to relieve that pressure, you can give up a pawn, sometimes even a little bit more, to gain some activity. So it might not even be best for white here to win material. You could also just continue to build up. But because white has this option, black has to try something else. So let's say black saw this, and after knight d2, castles instead. Now after knight e4, queen c7, knight d6, black tries to defend the d7 pawn with rook d8. Notice of course here again, white could play knight takes c8, followed by queen takes d7, winning a pawn. So black defends with rook d8. In fact, this would be a bad way to defend, because black has all of his pieces tied down trying to defend a pawn. What he should have done, like I mentioned before, is give up the pawn to try to gain a little bit of mobility. I would play rook f3. Preparing to triple up on the d file, rook, and queen are a tremendously powerful battery, aiming at the d7 pawn. One thing that you should know is that the optimal tripling formation is rook, queen, rook, like this. But after rook f3, white has another idea. He wants to play rook g3, shifting to a kingside attack. I want you to see how that knight on d6 locks down all of black's position. Black has nothing active. This brings up another critical principle. You see, black has that d7 pawn, which is weak. He also has developmental problems, which is another weakness. And he has a weak king, because the rook on d8, the queen on c7, the bishop on c8, they're all locked down defending the center and the queen side. They can't get to the king side. So black has two main weaknesses, the d7 pawn and the g7 pawn around the king. This is called the principle of two weaknesses. It's very hard when you have a positional. So let's say that black plays here b5, trying to develop. What would you do now? No, that's not quite right. Try again. 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 That's right. Now white should shift all of his pieces to the king side. The first move would be queen e4. You see, this attacks the rook on a8 and also plans to shoot into the g6 square. It also stops black from developing one more time, because bishop b7 now loses a piece because the knight and the queen are both piled up on that square. So this is a perfect example of how to win a position with a strategical advantage. White stops all of black's ideas while continuing to go ahead with his. Queen e4 attacks the rook on a8. The rook has to move. Let's say black plays rook a7. Now white can jump into the king side. Queen g6. Finally, black gets to develop his bishop with bishop b7, but it's too late. What would you play now with white? Good job. Here it's all over after rook g3. The queen and the rook are piled up in that g7 pawn, which will be checkmate. Black can't defend, and white will win this game. So here you saw a number of strategic and tactical devices flowing together. We used forks, removing the defender, occupying a weak square, threatened to pile up on the d-file, and ultimately we shifted to a kingside attack based on the principle of two weaknesses. This is what chess is all about. Understanding weak squares and creating outposts are critical to your game. There will be exercises later on in the mastery quiz, so if you're unsure about anything in this section, you might want to review it again before moving on. We just covered a lot of ground. All of the principles you're learning so far will help you navigate and evaluate complex chess positions. We're seeing that different factors, which sometimes seem completely irrelevant, have profound impact on the strength or weakness of various pieces. It's the pawns that make a bishop good or bad. They also determine the supremacy of knight or bishop, and usually determine the strategic direction of the game. Now that we're seeing how previously unnoticeable elements of the chess landscape are key factors in determining the heart of the position, we should be actively using our new knowledge to mold positions into what works best for our surviving warriors. And we should learn how to trade away the pieces that are not so well suited for the nuances of a certain battlefield. This is the art of the trade. Okay, here are some guiding principles. Generally, you should trade pieces when, first, you are ahead in material. Second, you have a spatial disadvantage. Third, an exchange will make one of your surviving pieces more powerful. And fourth, you'll be getting rid of a very powerful piece of the opponent. First of all, you want to trade when you're ahead in material. The reason for this is, the more you trade down, the bigger your advantage actually gets. Think about pawns. If you have 8 pawns and your opponent has 7, you're up 1 pawn, fine. But if you trade one pair of pawns, 7 to 6. In fact, 7 to 6 is a bigger advantage than 8 to 7. 8 to 7 is a smaller ratio. If you continue to trade down, 6 to 5, 5 to 4, 4 to 3, 3 to 2, 2 to 1, now suddenly you have twice as many pawns as your opponent. You trade down one more pawn, suddenly you have a pawn, your opponent has no pawns. A big advantage, obviously. This holds true with all of the pieces. If you're ahead in material, by trading down you actually increase your advantage. Take a look at this position. It's white to move. What would you do? Well, here white is up a pawn, and has a bishop for a knight in an open game. But there's a way to simplify into a winning endgame. What is white's best move? That's right. The correct move is bishop takes c6. This may seem unprincipled because the bishop is slightly stronger than the knight because it's an open game. But in this case, white can force a position which is relatively easy to win. As a rule, whenever you can reduce the complexity of a position into an endgame in which the path to victory is clear, do it. After bishop takes c6, black recaptures b takes c6, otherwise the back rank is undefended. Now you can continue to trade off. Rook d8 check. Black has to capture, rook takes d8. White plays rook takes d8. Once again, check, black has to take it. Rook takes d8. Now white plays queen takes d8 check. Black's only defensive mate is queen f8. Now white trades once more. Queen takes f8, king takes f8. Now look at this position. While in the first position the pawn might not have seemed so important, now the slight material edge is decisive. Now let me show you how to win this king and pawn endgame. First of all, we know what to do. Activate the king. A critical principle in the endgame is to activate the king. So white can play king e2. Let's say black knows how to do that too. King e7. What you'll actually find when you play endgames against beginners is a lot of them don't know to activate their king. So you can win easily. But here you play king d3, king d6. Now let's say you make the move b4. What your plan's going to be in this position is next to play king d4. Then you could play the move a4 at one point. The queen side is really where you're going to focus. A basic way to win this position is to make a pass pawn on the queen side and distract black's king with it. Black will have to defend on the queen side, and then you can run your king to the king side. Remember I talked about the principle of 2 weaknesses. This applies in the endgame as well. White's potential pass pawn on the queen side is one weakness, and black's kingside pawns is the second weakness. So let's say black were to make a normal move, like f6 here. Now with white, you could even choose to play b5 right away. Black would take the pawn, c takes b5. And now let's say white plays a takes b5. Black plays a takes b5. C takes b5. Now, white has a pass pawn on b5. Black's going to have to defend it. Let's say black moves his king back, trying to blockade the pawn with king c7. Now white can play king c5. Now let's say black makes the move king b7. Now white doesn't have to do this right away. White can take some time expanding on the king side first. What I want you to see here is that white can run his king to the king side and win the game. So you can play king d6. Now the black king has to take some time on the b pawn. King b6, king e7, king takes b5, king f7. And now it's clear that white's winning the game. Next, white will play king takes g7, take the f6 pawn. You can even take the h7 pawn. Then, slowly but surely, you'll push these 3 pawns up the board, queen one of them, and win the game. I go more deeply into detail about this type of position in the endgame course, and I really recommend you pay careful attention to those lessons after you finish this academy. For now, just think about the principle of two weaknesses, activating your king, and trading into winning endgames when you're ahead in material. The second principle of trading is that when you have a spatial disadvantage, it's good to trade. If your position is cramped, trading pieces will relieve your pressure. On the other hand, when the opponent is cramped, you want to increase pressure without allowing the liberation of exchanges. Here you can see that white has a huge spatial advantage and total central domination. Black has wasted a lot of time on flank moves, and now white is in control. Put yourself in black's shoes for a second. It's very hard to find a path of action. White, on the other hand, can easily develop with moves like bishop e3, bishop d3, castles, queen e2, rook a to e1, f5, etc. One of the biggest pluses of white's position is that he can develop freely while black is cramped. Now, imagine if black could trade kingside knights. Now take off the queenside knights. Suddenly black is gaining breathing room, and white's advantage is shrinking. So, when you have a spatial advantage, you want to increase pressure and avoid most exchanges. When you are defending positions with a spatial disadvantage, on the other hand, obviously the reverse holds true. You want to trade down as much as possible. Okay, the third principle of trading. When an exchange will make one of your surviving pieces more powerful, it's usually a good one. For example, you've already learned about good bishops and bad bishops, while sometimes trading off your opponent's last knight will make his bad bishop even worse. This is the type of situation we're looking for. So we've already seen some examples of this type of strategical trading. Here's another one. Here black has a huge hole in his position, the e6 square. It's white to move. What would you play? That's right. White's best move is bishop h3, and suddenly white's position becomes completely dominant. After the trade of bishops, the white knight will lodge on e6, causing big problems for black. Notice that the black knight, though right next to e6, is actually quite far from the square, because it would take him 3 moves to get there. In this type of position, there's no time for that kind of maneuver, because white's kingside attack would build too quickly. So here a well-thought-out trade, like bishop h3, can make a huge advantage emerge from nowhere. When the bishops are gone, the white knight on e6 will become a devastating force. Now take a look at this exercise. Black to move. What would you do? Good job. The correct move is bishop g4. Okay, it's true, this is technically a good bishop. But after the bishop for knight trade, the black knight becomes an absolute monster on d4. Take a look at it. Getting rid of the knight on f3 made the black knight capable of dominating the center of the board. And the white bishop is terrible. This is a perfect example of good knight against bad bishop. The fourth principle of trading is pretty straightforward, when you'll be getting rid of a very powerful piece of the opponent. Like in this exercise, it's white's move. Here black's knight on e3 is a thorn in white's side. The top priority should be to get rid of this powerful piece. What would you do? You have to calculate several moves ahead here. That's not the best move. Good job. Here there are two possible solutions. Either move the queen, say to c1, and then play knight b1 to d2 to f1, trading off the knight on f1 for the knight on e3, getting rid of black's strong piece. Or you could play a4 on the first move, followed by knight a3 to c2. Personally, I prefer the first alternative because it doesn't further weaken white's pawn structure. By playing a4, you create another hole on b4. But the most important thing is to recognize the need to drive out the black knight. Okay, you're about to jump into the mastery quiz, but first let's review the 4 principles of trading. First of all, you trade down when you're ahead in material. The more material that comes off, the bigger your advantage gets. Next, you trade off when you have a spatial disadvantage. If your opponent is crunching down on you, by trading off pieces, you relieve the pressure on your position. Third, you trade when an exchange will make one of your surviving pieces more powerful. For example, when trading bishop for knight, will leave you with a position with a very strong knight against a bad bishop of your opponent's. And fourth, you trade when you'll be getting rid of a very powerful piece of your opponent. Now, on to the mastery quiz. Okay, congratulations, you've come so far. Now you're ready for the mastery quiz. This test will involve positions in which you'll have to decide on the best plan given the strategic landmarks of the positions. Now these positions are not so simple, and the solutions won't necessarily be forced continuations. I'll be asking you to find plans based on the principles we've discussed in this section of the course. It's true, some of the solutions may involve tactical devices from part 2, but the theme of every problem is a strategic one. Remember, each one of the exercises is an opportunity to learn. If you struggle with it and can't find the answer, that's okay. The key is to work your mind, do the best you can, and then learn from my description. One secret about chess study is that you can only take as much as you give. In other words, if you don't even try to solve the problem and just listen to my explanation, you won't learn nearly as much as you would if you try to think creatively about each situation. Now let's rise to the challenge. Here it's white to move. Remember, strategical problem solving is not necessarily based on winning material or anything so dramatic, but the type of thought process necessary for these problems is what lays the groundwork for decisive tactics. In this position, notice the differences in the white and black armies, and play the move which resolves the central conflict to your liking. It's white to move. What do you think? Excellent work. Okay, white has 2 knights versus 2 bishops. We know that bishops like open diagonals and open games, and knights prefer closed games where they can use their unique ability to jump over pieces. So the correct move is d5, closing the game and setting up a pawn structure that's advantageous given your surviving warriors. If you can spot the key strategic issues in a position, then the best move can be clear as day. Now, imagine if you didn't know the pros and cons of different pawn structures for knights and bishops. You might play d takes e5, and after bishop takes e5, black would have a devastating dark squared bishop, and perhaps more importantly, 2 bishops and a semi-open game. After d5, white's position is good. After d takes e5, black dominates. Okay, take a look at this position. Who do you think is better here? Think about what makes the bishop strong and weak. That's right. It turns out that black is much better, because white has a bad bishop. All his pawns are on dark squares, so the bishop is constricted, and has no targets. 2 other factors you may have noticed is that it's a closed game, which favors the knight, and white has more pawn islands. Altogether, white's in trouble. In this position, white just played bishop takes c6. It's black's move. How should he recapture? No, that's not quite right. Try again. No, that's not quite right. Try again. Good job. Black should recapture towards the center, with b takes c6, and suddenly the hole on d5 disappears. After rook takes c6 or knight takes c6, white can anchor a knight on d5, which is very problematic for black. Always look for ways to shore up your weaknesses when you have the chance to change your pawn structure. In this position, you can see that white has a big spatial advantage. What's white's best move? That's not the best move. 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 Good move. Of course, the main question here is, should white trade the light-squared bishops? The h3 bishop and d7 bishop are lined up. It's important to focus on the right principle here. If some of you notice that the central pawns seem to make the black light-squared bishop a good one, that's okay. But this position is very dynamic, and the central pawn structure has a lot of potential to change. The most important theme to notice is white's huge spatial advantage, which gives black a hard time developing. If instead of trading, white plays, for example, f5, then the kingside pressure increases and black can't bring the knight on b8 into the game. Notice, of course, that if after f5 black tries to steal a pawn with g takes h5, then he has only weakened himself further, and there's no way to hold on to the material. Remember, when you have a spatial advantage, increase the pressure without allowing piece trades. Okay, this is a different type of position. It's white's move. What should you play? That's not the best move. Good job. The game is open here, so if white can trap the black king in the center, the end is near. Bishop c5 is a devastating move. Black can't castle through check, and next will be rook e1 check, after which black will be forced to run into an open board with a scared king. White should win if he can find this quiet prophylactic move that freezes black's development. Here you can see that black has up a huge amount of material, but white has a powerful mating attack. With that in mind, find the best move to defend. No, that's not quite it. Excellent work. Here your strategic understanding should tell you to look for a tactic that will use exchanges to get rid of the white queen. Then the endgame would be completely winning for black. Knight f4 check is a great move, sacrificing the knight while forking white's king. Black's whole idea is to give up some material to set up a decisive trade. White has to play g takes f4 or else he loses a queen. Now what should black play? Good job. Queen g6 check, and suddenly white's attack is over. The queens come off, and black will win easily. So in this example you can see how understanding the principles of when to trade can help guide your tactical vision. White had a huge attack, black gave up a little bit of material to stop the attack and trade into a winning endgame. It's black to move here. What would you do? That's right. Obviously the main question is, should black trade into a king and pawn endgame? Here the critical theme to notice is the outside passed pawn. After the trade, white will have the active king, but he has to run all the way to the queen side to stop the a-pawn. You can calculate out the answer, but you can also immediately know the solution by seeing how the outside passed pawn stretches white out too far. It would play out like this. Queen takes e4, an excellent move, trading into a winning endgame, because after queen takes e4, rook takes e4, king takes e4, black plays a4, pulling the white king to the queen side. King d4. Then black can play a3, forcing king c3. Now the black king comes into the game. King e5. White plays king b3, king e4, king takes a3, king e3. King b3, king takes e2. And now the decisive factor of the game is that the black king is much closer to the kingside pawns. White plays king c3, king f3, king d4, king takes g3, king e5, king takes h4, king f6, g5. Black's up 2 pawns, he'll make a queen and win the game. Once again, we can see how strategic understanding can combine with calculation. This might seem like a long variation to calculate, but all the moves are forced if you combine the themes. The outside passed pawn, the principle of 2 weaknesses, passed pawns must be pushed, and king activity in the endgame. White to move here. What's the best move? Good job. What white has to do to win this game is gobble up all black's h-pawns, which are pretty useless, but they're passed over there. And then he has to bring the king to the queen side and make a queen. But if white plays king f2, then black can just play king a7. Next move for black will be king takes a6, then black will win the b2 pawn, white will win all the h-pawns, but it'll be drawn. After the powerful move b4, black plays king a7, attacking the a6 pawn, and now white plays b5, setting up a critical pawn chain. Here, black plays king b6, and now white has all the time in the world. King f2. Black can never take the pawn on b5, because then he can't get back in time. White can play a7, a8, and make a queen. So black has to keep control of the a7 square. King a7, king g2, king b6, king h3. There's nothing black can do. He's completely helpless. White will just take all the h-pawns, bring the king over, and win the game. This is how. Now, when you reach this position, you don't want to make a mistake. Watch out for stalemate. If you play king c7 and he plays king a8, you don't want to play b6 here. That would be stalemate. What a terrible way to end a chess game. So in this position, you can just play king c6. Then after king b8, you can play b6. If black plays king c8, then a7, followed by queening. And if black plays king a8, what do you do now? Well, a7 would be terrible, because that's stalemate as well. King c7 would also be a terrible move. Stalemate. You can just play b7. Now if black plays king a7, then after king c7, next move is to promote. And if black plays king b8, here you can just give up the a-pawn. a7 check, king takes a7, king c7. Next move is b8 queen, and white will win easily. So this is the winning plan. The key theme in this problem is the protected passed pawn. The pawn chain b5 and a6 made the black king completely helpless. Okay, in this position it's black's move. The themes to be considered here are perpetual check, trading pieces, and the protected passed pawn. Black should make some careful strategical decisions before deciding how to continue. Black to move. Take your time. No, that's not quite it. Try again. No, that's not quite it. Try again. That's not the best move. Clearly white is up 2 pawns, so trading queens would be to his advantage. Black can take either the d3 pawn or the g2 pawn. It turns out that both are mistakes. First, if black plays queen takes d3, what can you play with white? No, that's not quite right. Try again. No, that's not quite right. Try again. No, that's not quite right. Try again. Yep, that's it. The correct move is queen e4 check, forcing the trade of queens. After queen takes e4, f takes e4, white is up a pawn in the king and pawn endgame, and white will win this one. Black knows that he can't allow a trade of queens because he's down a pawn after queen takes d3. So again, queen d3 allows queen e4 check, trading queens to win the endgame. If queen takes g2, white also has a way of trading queens. Do you see it? No, that's not quite right. Try again. 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 The correct line here is queen h5 check, king g7, queen g4 check. Again, forking king and queen, forcing a queen trade. After queen takes g4, f takes g4, white's up a pawn with 3 dangerous passers, an easy win for white. Now, what's the option? That's not the best move. That's not the best move. Good job. The correct move is queen c1 check, attempting to draw by perpetual check. Perpetual check is when one side can keep on checking the other one for the rest of the game. White has to play king a2 here, then black can play queen c2 check. Now, if king a1, then black can just repeat the position. Queen c1 check again, king a2, queen c2 check. The only other option that white has is king a3. And now, what's the difference? Well, now we can take the d3 pawn with tempo. Remember, we always want to find the most forcing alternatives. Queen takes d3 check. You take the pawn with check. Now white has two options, either king a2 or king b2 going backwards, or king a4 or king b4 going forwards. In either case, black has the same option. Let's say king b4, queen now can come to d2 check. You see, this is forking the king and the pawn on g2. White plays, say, king b3, king b5 is also fine, and then queen takes g2. Now it's even material. White has pawns on f3 and h4 that are both weak. Black's position is perfectly fine. A key theme to queen endings is having the move, having tempo. Black was able to check, take a pawn with check, then win another pawn, and now the position should be drawn. Black saves the game by not taking material right away, but taking material at the right moment. Alright, so this is your final exercise, and it's a very subtle one, so take your time. It's black to move here. You have to optimize your position. No, that's not quite right. Try again. 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 I would begin with bishop takes h3, because this leads to a good knight versus bad bishop ending. Bishop takes h3, g takes h3. The next move is the important one. So we know that white can't take on a6 because the bishop on c6 hangs. White has to move the king c4. Now a good move for black would be to play king e5. So here black's up a pawn, but most importantly he has that a5 pawn, which makes the white king stay guarding the queen side. So black's path to winning this position is pretty straightforward. He has the knight and the king together on the king side, playing against the lone white bishop, or the lone white king. You see, white could also decide to make his bishop defend the a-pawn, but then the white king would be alone defending the king side. In either case, it'll be 2 against 1 on the king side. Black will win easily. So always look to maximize your strategical situation. Look back. If here, the black pawn was on a7, white would be perfectly fine, because black would hardly be up a pawn. The a-pawn can never move because of b takes a6 en passant. But in this position, white is in big trouble. Often the subtlest of improvements can prove decisive, and we can spot them by putting together our expanding arsenal of strategic and tactical principles. Congratulations, you've graduated the Chessmaster Academy and are now prepared to journey deeper into the black and white jungle. There are many options open to you at this point. We've designed Chessmaster to be a companion that can guide you all the way to mastery, and you can have a great time on the way. After all, Chessmaster is teacher, mentor, ultimate opponent. I would recommend that you try out what you've learned so far playing with friends, or against the various quirky personalities we've created in Chessmaster. These personalities are a fabulous training tool. You can start off playing some beginner opponents, and over time work your way through the gauntlet of stronger and stronger adversaries. Chess is a psychological game, and with this approach you can have fun testing yourself, and you'll get used to noticing the habits of your opponents. But watch out. You may run into me as a 6-year-old, and if you keep on progressing you can take me on at various stages of my development. Regarding your chess education, I'd recommend that your next step be to turn to my endgame course. The endgame is truly a window into the heart of chess, and the lessons from this course can be applied to all your chess games. Then when you feel increasingly confident, and you're working your way up through the gauntlet of personalities, you should check out my annotated games and psychology of competition course. In these features I'll guide you through some of my most exciting encounters from high-stakes competition around the globe. You'll see the drama through my eyes, while I describe the thrill of top-rank chess competition. I look forward to working with you further down the Chessmaster experience. Until then, enjoy the jungle.